So the question is two-part question about how to know whether what one is practicing or studying corresponds to the Buddha's teachings, the original Buddha's teachings. And the second part of the question concerned with, which is basically a follow-up to the first question about Pāli literature, as I like to call it, or the Tipitaka, the Pāli Tipitaka, and the extent by which it is representative of original teachings of the Buddha. So this is, of course, a very big issue, full of details, and I'm aware of the importance of this issue. When I was beginning my journey myself, I was kind of lost also amidst the abundance of sources of information online, books, talks, etc. And it was also very difficult for me to find out or figure out which of all these sources is really representative of a substantial understanding of the Buddha's teachings. So it is a prominent issue, and it affects many sincere and purposeful interested people who have strong interest in Buddhism. Of course, naturally, I mean, when I was beginning, the search after a more original or direct representation of the teachings of the Buddha led me to Pāli literature and to the Tipitaka and Sutta Pitaka in particular. And this is also something that many people experience. You gradually move from reading secondary literature or listening to explanations of the Dharma by other people, and you keep looking for the speech of the Buddha himself, and eventually you reach the suttas. But this is many people, once they arrive at that situation, they don't necessarily feel that their understanding is improving, and I feel that this is the real question that you want to ask here. Is, well, having read the what's considered to be the speech of the Buddha, the original teachings of the Buddha, in translation mostly, and still have a problem in figuring out what really is the teaching of the Buddha, and still also confused about all the various interpretations of the Pāli text or of the Dhamma that is preserved in it. And so it's also true that even after reading the original Pāli and relying on it, we find ourselves also still looking for contemporary sources of information, with the hope that we will find there a clear and vivid representation of the teachings that are bypass the ambiguity and obscurity that is rampant in translations of Pāli literature, or Sanskrit in the case of Mahayana Buddhism. So this is, of course, a very important issue, and I really don't know what to say, because when I started, and that was perhaps how many years ago? Many years ago when I started, it was already overwhelming. The flooding of information about Buddhism was all over the place, and I presume that this could only have increased by now. That there are more books, there are more talks. I myself produced one book so far. I give talks every now and then, and just adding to that torrent of information. Everybody is contributing, doing his part in trying to represent the teachings of the Buddha. And so it's very difficult to make a categorization of the teachings out there, or to try to make an evaluation of their efficacy or their authenticity or anything of that sort, because it's just, there is way too much. But what we can do is to perhaps try to learn how to judge or evaluate the efficacy, authenticity of any teaching, any Buddhist teaching, by means of evaluating its impact on us, its effect on us. And I think this is the most straightforward way to do it, and the most direct way to do it, and the most certain way to do it. And this requires actually that one is to put aside all other circumstantial variables of evaluation and judgments, like who is talking, what kind of qualifications they have, what is it that they're saying about themselves and about their experience, how many other people trust them or mistrust them. All these circumstantial variables is just to be put aside completely and to be regarded as totally irrelevant. And then you listen to the teaching and you apply it in your experience, and then you see whether it is working out or not. This, by so doing, we would actually be following the advice of the Buddha himself, at least as reported in the Pāli text. And I think this is where this idea came to me from, the idea of evaluating the efficacy of a teaching by means of observing its impact, its efficacy, whether it is actually allowing us to make progress or not, whether by applying it in the course of time we see ourselves making progress, or becoming wiser, becoming calmer, becoming more knowledgeable about certain aspects of Dhamma that were before that inaccessible. That's what the Buddha himself advises according to the Pāli text, and I think it's the best way to judge or evaluate any kind of teaching that is of an experiential nature, and of course Dhamma is par excellence. And you see, this corresponds to the way Dhamma is regarded in the Pāli literature. Dhamma as an experiential field, and expressions such as Sandittika, Akalika, Ehipasika, Opanayika, all these expressions are referring to something that manifests its efficacy with immediacy, and it is also substantial. It's not its impact or effect is not fleeting, is not momentary. There is a accumulation of knowledge, of wisdom, of experience, of skill, things of that sort. So these are regarded to be the features which distinguish and characterize and define the teaching of the Buddha. And this means that any representation of the teaching of the Buddha should have that same effect, right? And I think this is really the only way through which every individual can independently evaluate and judge the authenticity and efficacy of any teaching. The only point I want to emphasize again, I already mentioned it, but I want to emphasize it again, is matters of trust and matters of following a teacher or following a certain interpretation just because it is popular or authoritative or highly regarded by others, and so on. There is a very strong tendency in life in general. I would say there's a very strong tendency in the mammalian species in general to follow some authority. This is a feature, an evolutionary feature, particularly very visible in our mammalian species, right? This is of course of a great evolutionary utility in the case of things such as escape from danger, the pursuit of opportunities, finding food, organizing the community, things of that sort. Of course you need leadership and you need someone to follow in the event you're unable to depend on yourself. But it's inconceivable for me that these evolutionary unconscious attitudes should be extended over to matters of conceptual and abstract and spiritual nature. It is completely inappropriate to think that even in these domains that are exclusively human, one is to follow the same way that animals follow in their lives. This is something that I wrote about before, and I think it's really important that in abstract matters, in spiritual matters, in the field of Dhamma practice and progressing in Dhamma, I believe it's really essential and important and urgent to develop the maximum possible extent of independence as soon as possible, and to not follow anyone or any authority, and to not trust so easily in discourses or in teachings or interpretations without having these ideas pass through a very meticulous and scrutinizing process of independent evaluation. And that evaluation, as I just mentioned, must always be based on experience. It's not that someone speaks in a way that you like or say ideas that you like and then you say, okay, that's enough. That's my favorite teacher now. That's my favorite interpretation or interpretive approach or anything of that sort. That's not enough. The teaching must manifest its efficacy in experience. You must find yourself making actual progress, and only then will you be certain that what you've learned, what you've been taught, is worthwhile and is worthy of your trust. Before that, I'd say it's extremely dangerous, because I have seen so many examples of people who are highly gifted, highly talented for this kind of practice, and with incredible levels of sincerity and purpose and determination, that is just because of the painful scarcity of sources of knowledge and information and reliable and effective sources of information and teaching, they end up following something, whatever it is that they find, because all of us are, to an extent or another, need help. All of us actually need guidance at certain junctions in this remarkable journey. And so this, once they give their trust so easily, and because there are no other sources of, or alternative sources of teaching, they lose a lot of time, and sometimes they just lose interest in the whole thing and eventually drop out of this most incredibly meaningful and profound meaning of life. They continue to be interested in Buddhism, but they no longer really follow it because they don't see themselves making progress, and they lose the way basically, and they lose their own trust or their own self-confidence that it's possible to make further progress, despite of the fact that nobody is more suited for that kind of practice than them, given the qualities that they have. So I've seen many examples of this failure, simply just failure in people who should otherwise succeed. And that's partly because the absence of guidance. And I'm not saying that guidance is not important. I'm just saying that it is rare to find. and it is extremely rare to find. And that means that an alternative must be developed, and that the only alternative that is feasible is independent inquiry, independent experimentation, self-reliance. That's why I emphasize this too much, because I myself always hoped for a long time to find proper guidance. It's easier when there is guidance, when there is a teacher, and it's not just a teacher. The problem is that you need several qualities or combined in the same person at the same time. You need someone who's advanced, if not accomplished, at least advanced along the path of practice. You need someone who has verbal, linguistic skills with which to convey subtle experiences that are associated with practice. And then you need someone who has the intuition with which to understand you, and you in particular, your temperament, your personality, your limitations, your strengths. That needs a lot of intuition by the teacher in order to be able to give you the most effective teaching that is suitable to you and not necessarily to someone else. That's very rare to find. By the most teachers that we have will give a generic teaching for everyone to follow. And finally, you need someone who is good in teaching. You could find someone who is very advanced in practice, but not necessarily possess all these other qualities. There are a lot of examples of this. So it's only reasonable, it's only expected that teachers of that sort should be very rare. And most likely they've always been rare. So until you find such a teacher, I think it's very important to be very cautious and to not settle with just anything, because you can't find the optimal or the best kind of guidance. I think that there is no escape. Sooner or later, even if you have a good guidance, by the way, this is a path of training and practice that necessarily, eventually, requires a sufficient extent of independence and of self-reliance. And the earlier one makes or develops the kind of courage and resolve to go in that somewhat lonely direction, because you know that you're alone and you know that you have to rely on yourself in everything. The earlier one goes in that direction. I think it will eventually be much better for the future, and one will eventually actually succeed, especially if he's endowed with determination and sincerity. There's no reason for someone with qualities like these to fail, rather it should succeed. It's going to be harder without guidance. It's going to be will require a lot of time and effort spent experimenting and focusing with one's own experience, what works, what doesn't work, things of that sort. But in the end, it will work out. Supposing, of course, that you are not interested in something else more than your interest in growing in the path of Buddhist emancipation. So now we come to the second part of the question about Pāli literature, and this is a very big issue. I will try to address it briefly here. Well, I think it's I wrote a lot about this before. I had a paper titled Issues with Pāli Literature and Its Translation, and I wrote it perhaps a couple of years ago or so. Now, the fact that we have any Pāli text at all is in fact something that is so wonderful. We are so lucky, we are unbelievably lucky to have any kind of text like this at all, because there isn't any other kind of text that show us or represent to us the teachings of the Buddha better than the Pali text. So there is clear evidence that this is the earliest kind of documentation of the wisdom of the Buddha. It doesn't mean that it is early, by the way. This is a problem with the expression early Buddhism. Nobody knows what is early Buddhism. There is no such thing as early Buddhism. There is the Pali text, and the Pali text is not early. It is I mean, by normal standards, it is. We don't know exactly when it was written, but the earliest estimation says something like first century BCE or first century CE. This is about 500 years or so after the time of the Buddha, and this means that this is a very late text in relation to the events that it narrates. And then, of course, this text passed necessarily through a process of writing, copying, and these things are very complicated. We learn a lot about how much text can change through these processes, from the study of ancient Egyptian or Greek texts, sometimes also in biblical studies, and in studies in the manuscripts of the Middle Ages. Researchers devote their entire lives trying to trace features of authenticity or inauthenticity in manuscripts. And that from this kind of research, we learn a lot about how simply copying is something that could in many cases dramatically change certain aspects about the contents of any given literature or text. Before that, we had an oral tradition, and of course we also learned from studies on oral memorization that here the influence of the memorizer, of the person that is chanting or memorizing the text, is so great, and the possibility of forgetting things or changing things is so much higher, and a lot of the time it happens spontaneously or unconsciously. And I started reading about this, or interest myself in it, when I started looking into this whole issue of authenticity. This was some years ago, and I remember finding a number of very interesting studies on oral memorization in traditional societies in Africa. They were mostly done by French researchers, and they've done remarkable work. They actually trace a certain narrative, a folk tale or a cosmological narrative. They would trace the transformation of the story from how it is narrated at one generation, and then they keep following that story as it progresses throughout successive generations. And a number of studies on this were very illuminating in the extent by which a single narrator could change a lot of things, sometimes in details, sometimes in the very plot or in the very purpose of the story, and how this happens sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes to meet with events that are happening in the environment. An earthquake or a tornado comes, and then the story begins to feature these elements of nature and so on. So it was really enlightening as to the impact of the practice of oral memorization on the even essential, possibly essential aspects of the content of literature or text. So we have all this long history of the process of carrying the teachings of the Buddha from the time when they were uttered by the Buddha himself, all the way until the first appearance of manuscripts in writing, including whole sections of what we today call the Tipitaka. So this is kind of like a brief history of the development of the Pali text that we have today. And of course, when you have that in perspective, well, you naturally begin to consider whether the contents of it are trustworthy or not. And this is, of course, a vast issue of research, and it's ongoing. And unfortunately, there has been very little progress in it. I mean, most of the research has been already done during perhaps the first half of the 20th century, when the Pali text was discovered by the West. And ever since then, there has been very little progress or new developments in this field, as far as I know. And I think it's just partly because there are no possibilities of research, and this is something that is known about Indian history in general, especially history of texts. You see, what is it that requires or what is it that makes us aware of the process of the impact of the process of writing and copying in the Greek case, or in the Egyptian case, or in the medieval case in medieval Europe, is because there are multiplicity of manuscripts, and we compare them, and we apply all the technology that we have in dating their time of writing and things of that sort. There are enough historical documents. Historical documents mean that documents that are written either in the time of the events that it describes or not too long after that. And this allows us to see and to study how documents and historical texts are produced, and what are the variables that contribute or influence their contents. We don't have anything of the sort in the case of Pali literature. And even the discovery of the Gandharan manuscripts, which was kind of hoped to contribute a lot to our knowledge, isn't really kind of like limited contribution so far, and so we cannot really. You can follow this kind of research and inquiry if you like, and you will find so many references, and it keeps going on and on. But in my estimation, there is hardly anything new, and it's not possible through academic research to really come to strong conclusions or substantial conclusions about the authenticity or inauthenticity of Pali text as we have today. Now, the thing that is of importance to me is even if research can show us what aspects or what portions of the text are inauthentic, what other portions of the text are authentic, to my mind, it doesn't really make a lot of difference, because in the end, as I was just saying in reply to the first part of the question, it's not the authority of the teaching that determines its worth. It's rather its impact, its efficacy, right? And so it doesn't matter at all whether a text is authentic or inauthentic, whether it's early or late, so long it is capable of conveying a vibrant meaning to you. So long, once you put it to practice, it proves itself to be effective, it gives rise to progress, then it's enough. That is enough to validate that kind of teaching. And so it really never really mattered to me, this dimension of authenticity, because I was curious about whatever text in just the same way as I'm curious about texts that are not even Buddhists, don't correspond to the Buddha's wisdom, as we read Western psychology, for example, as we read teachings from other religions, things of that sort. They as we read literature, even something that is not even a psychological teaching at all, just a piece of literature, a novel. Now, these things and everything in life in general contributes to your wisdom and contributes to your uh, uh, um, awareness of why you're here and what you're doing here, and whatever it is that proves its efficacy in improving your mental state and your mental clarity should be welcome. And so, to me, the dimension of authenticity is not really relevant at all. And there is danger associated with it, because for some people, they want to restrict themselves to what's regarded as authentic. And as I mentioned, it's not really possible to come to strong conclusions about what's authentic and what's not. And this means that, if you keep looking for what's authentic, and then you're only limiting your scope of possibilities of learning. I mean, look at the teachings of someone like Venerable Ajahn Chah, for example. Now, these are not in any way authentic teachings in the sense that they are coming from the Buddha. They are coming from a contemporary practitioner. But when you read his talks and his teachings, their impact and the wisdom which manifest in those teachings, that's it. That's all that it takes. And I think this is really the thing that also should be looked after in the suttas, for example. You read all sorts of suttas, and then it doesn't matter whether someone regards that sutta as authentic or inauthentic, or regards that teaching as this or that. You just read it and try to imagine in the same way as we read the teachings of Ajahn Chah, as you read the suttas in the same way. And then you will find that certain teachings from the suttas evoke a certain kind of vibrant response from you, and that's enough. That's good enough. And I think there are so many examples of this, even in the translated text as we have it today. It still is very much capable in many cases of conveying a lot of vibrant meaning and effective meaning, and despite of all the limitations that we have in these translations. So that's really the thing that I could give here as an advice, is there's nothing in it for you, that is to restrict yourself to what's authentic, what's original, basically because it's very difficult to come to conclusions that are firm and certain about what's original and what's not. And secondly, because it doesn't really make any difference. You just expose yourself to all sorts of possible teachings. Of course, don't waste your time, pursuing things that are evidently not very useful, or not coming from any true experience or knowledge. But at the same time, there's no reason at all to limit oneself or limit one's scope of learning and experience to something only because it is declared to be original or authentic or something of that sort. And more than this is how the interpretation of the original Pāli text actually requires advances in experience. And this is something that is so strangely not usually considered. And this is a situation that we have in the case of Pāli literature. People who are regarded to be qualified to interpret the original text are people who are students and experts in language. So Pali language, Prakrit, Sanskrit, etc. These are the ones that are regarded to be the authorities in the translation and interpretation of Pali literature, which is so strange, because if you judge by the content rather than the language of Pali literature, you'll find that we are talking about something that is entirely experiential and practical, which is Dhamma. But Dhamma is the field of experience and the field of practice. Now, there is of course an abstract or conceptual dimension to it, but even in that case, it's not language that matters. It's the engagement with the conceptual and abstract dimensions, in exactly the same way as we see in, say, the Greek case, for example. If you want to make an interpretation of an ancient Greek philosophic text, who is going to be most qualified for the job? It's not necessarily someone who's expert in the Greek language, in the ancient Greek language. It actually must be someone who is an expert in philosophy, and specifically in ancient Greek philosophy. Now, that person needs to know the Greek language too. Of course, it goes without saying, but it's not going to be sufficient for one to be expert in the Greek language in order to embark on an interpretation of ancient Greek philosophy. And it applies to about every other field of a similar nature. It's only in our case that people who are regarded to be most qualified to make an interpretation of ancient Pali text are people who are expert merely in the Pali language. And this is a very serious problem. I believe it's an unbelievably problematic. And to my mind, of course, it requires the interpretation, or effective interpretation of Pali text requires someone who is sufficiently advanced along the path of practice and on the path of what the Pali text is talking about, the content and not the language with which it is written. And we have a big problem in this field, and this is very interesting. You see how when you listen to teachings from contemporary teachers, their recorded teachings, such as Venerable Ajahn Chah, for example. Now you see that he wasn't particularly expert in the Pali language or anything of that sort, but obviously he was a very devout practitioner, and his interpretations and explanations of Dhamma practice are very unique and very enlightening, and that's because he himself happened to have, I believe, experienced those things. He's talking about what he experienced and not what he read in a book. And so this only reinforces the idea that whatever it is that you'll end up reading, either in a contemporary book about Dhamma or in the ancient Pali text, in both cases there is no escape from applying whatever it is that one learns and experience. And through the accumulation of experience and skill, only later, when you return to these texts, that you can make an evaluation of them. Also, it happens for many people will report this when they make advances in practice and then return to read suttas that they've read years before. They see dimensions in these texts that they weren't able to see before. It happens to a lot of people, and they begin to understand certain keywords in ways that weren't accessible before. So it's only experience and it's only practice that are going to reveal the Dhamma to any practitioner. It's not language, it's not text, it's not issues of authority, whether that of a teaching figure or of authenticity and originality or things of that sort. It's only your own momentary practice and experience. And there is nothing in this domain of Dhamma that surpasses the importance of practice and experience.